Okay, today's session is getting a bit of a basic understanding of the issues around domestic and family violence. It makes sense for us to start with a definition. So, domestic and family violence. Yes, also known as domestic violence. We'll get to a couple of different variations on it. I'm using the term domestic and family violence. It's a pattern of abusive behaviour in an intimate relationship that over time puts one person in a position of power over another and causes fear. So you notice that even though the word violence is in the term, in the actual term that we're describing here, it doesn't necessarily need to be the physical violence that people often think of. It's a pattern of coercion and control. So the abusers will sometimes call a perpetrator of violence. But keep in mind, there's a range of different types of power and coercion and control. Financial control, for example, if that's an abusive relationship, we'll still refer it to as domestic and family violence, or DV or DFV with those shortened names. So think a little bit broader than the physical hit, because the abusive relationship is often beyond. Well, the abuse often starts well before the actual physical touch, and for someone to be able to say, "Oh, but I never actually touched him or her, therefore it wasn't an abusive relationship," is a cop out, basically. So that's why. In Australia, we use the term domestic violence. In fact, some of our legislation has that enshrined as it's talking about domestic violence orders, for example, in some states. Family violence or partner violence. I'm using what I think is a fairly widespread term of domestic and family violence because it's not always partner violence. It's wider than that. I want to cast a wider net than just between spouses, between people in that sort of intimate relationship. It's a broader. Does that make sense? Okay. Overseas, you'll read a lot of stuff if you research this, and I'll actually talk about spouse battering. The word battering gets used quite a lot in the American literature, I've noticed. As I said, I'm moving away from that. Yeah, that's right. Battering sounds... It's like if you haven't actually been battered, then no, you weren't really a survivor of domestic violence. That's not what we're looking for here. Intimate partner violence, I've rejected that term, partly because it's not widely used in Australia, partly because it's not just about partners, it's sometimes other family members, and likewise for spouse abuse. So yes, there is financial abuse, there's emotional, there's psychological. A lot of the same terms you'd notice, and many of the same patterns when we're talking child abuse in one of our other lessons. And just because it didn't involve physical contact doesn't mean you guys have got it. Okay. So there's a couple of general principles that we'll be working on here. One is that we're going to be believing the survivor. So I'm again shifting away from the term victim because I want to acknowledge that there's actually a lot of resilience in people who have experienced the receiving end of domestic and family violence. So that's why we're using the term survivor, and we are believing what they've got to say. That's one of our general principles. Again, similar to what we've explored, nothing new here to you. Understanding they're not responsible for the abuse. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels, isn't there? A lot of parallels with child abuse, and really we're talking those relationships of the abuse of people in those sorts of relationships. Yeah, that's right. It's family violence, so the definition can encompass all of those sort of things. Whether somebody is a grown-up child or not, they can still be, if not considered survivors of child abuse, then cool. So understanding they're not responsible is that pattern that we have talked about with child abuse, is people feel, and part of the way the abuse works is people feel that they are responsible for what has happened. to them. That's one of our general principles, is let's understand that's not how it happens. And a key element is to collaborate with the service providers. They're the ones that have got the expert knowledge. They're the ones that we're working together with. And also understanding that it can take time. So I'm going to show you a cycle of the way relationships work in a moment. Some relationships work, and we'll see that it takes time. It's one of the frustrations of people working in those women's refuges. I can see lots of people nodding their heads. I understand there's people in the class who've got lived experience growing up, or family members or relatives. As we've talked about previously, take a break when you want. There's a reason we're delivering this online as well as face-to-face, but I appreciate the head nods. So yes, understand that people will make their own choices. That dignity of risk we've talked about before. People get the choice to make their own dumb decisions, despite the fact that it's plain to us and it's plain to them in retrospect that they were what I'm going to keep calling dumb, unwise decisions, unsafe decisions. Okay, I'm going to show you a cycle of abuse. It begins with the honeymoon phase, where things are happy, they seem really happy. It's nice, it's a nice space here, people are in love. Let's move on. There's then a build-up phase. So during this phase, the relationship still appears to be normal, but there's this tension building up, escalating, maybe some verbal and emotional abuse occurring at this stage, but the tensions are getting higher, and the perpetrator might be trying to avoid physical violence, but is only willing to sustain that if there's no challenge to his power or her power. The next phase is subtly different. In this phase, the perpetrator's behaviour escalates to the point where it's actually quite frightening for the survivor, and the subtle shift is that the survivor is likely to do whatever they can to prevent the explosion, and here's the difference, taking responsibility for the other person's behaviour. So in that build-up phase, we had the perpetrator taking more responsibility. In this phase, we've moved on. Here the survivor is feeling the need to take on more and more responsibility for how another person is behaving. And that's quite deliberately manipulated that way quite often, quite typically. We then hit the explosion. This is the violent phase. This is the peak of the violence. The perpetrator releases their anger on the survivor. And it could well be that the perpetrator gets this sense of relief, like it's finally all that tension is let go now, and that might then become something that they see as productive. They were able to actually get something out of it. They were able to release their tension. They were able to exert their coercion, and that might then reinforce subsequent anger. No great shock so far. It starts off nice, it gets worse and worse. But this is a cycle. So the interesting part is that the next phase is where we move on to what we call the remorse phase. This is where the perpetrator may well feel some shame for their lack of self-control during the explosion phase. So the actual attack is usually followed by some shocks and disbelief, absolute denial sometimes on part of both the abuser and the victim. There's this shock, this disbelief, this denial. And they might actually choose to withdraw from a relationship, either party, or try to justify it to themselves or to their partner, sort of saying, well, here's how it happened, here's why it happened. It wasn't that bad, really. They basically try to rationalise how serious it was. If there's physical injury, the victim tries to minimise it. Does that make sense? Again, I'm seeing people nodding their heads. So yeah, this is this is after the explosion. People trying to rationalise it, or people just feeling that that was just so unbelievable that they had to come to terms with what's just happened, and minimising that or trying to make sense of it somehow. Remorse, denial, disbelief, just complete and utter shock. So logical follow-on from that is what we call the pursuit phase. And that's where the perpetrator tries to make up to the survivor by making promises not to repeat. Attempts made by the perpetrator to buy back by giving gifts, by saying sorry, by saying it'll never happen again, by buying flowers. The survivor might still be frightened, but is just so damn relieved that the violence is over, that what they wanted more than anything was to think that the violence has ended. So they're quite willing to believe that he or she has said they're sorry, that they've bought flowers, that they've moved on. So it's what they want to hear more than anything, and so therefore this pursuit phase sadly then leads on to what we call the honeymoon phase, where things seem really nice. In fact, some people will call this the false honeymoon. They don't like honeymoons are nice spaces. So this is the false honeymoon in some models. Really, the power hasn't shifted. People don't want the relationship to end, so the phase is characterised by denial as to how bad it was. So there's this gradual denial building from the remorse and pursuit up to this stage here. It's pretty calm. Both people ignore the possibility of violence. In fact, just as the explosion phase over this right side here, just as that was marked by absolute brutality and loss, this is characterised by extreme loving, kind and remorseful behaviours. And yeah, out of the ordinary side. So that's what people sort of get hooked on and addicted to, and that's what they want so much that they're willing to grab it and ignore the fact that this is a cycle that often repeats. I've heard the statistic thrown around of repeating that process 5 or 6 times before the survivor makes the decision to break it off permanently. I can't find that confirmed anywhere, but that's a figure that people have thrown around and have said was realistic for them. Where the cycle repeats constantly, the later phases are going to fade and the cycle begins all over again. So, our response to people living in this cycle is going to be different depending on where they are in the cycle. Just as it was different for somebody who's, think about some of the other cycles we've looked at, the cycle of drug and alcohol motivation. Somebody who's highly motivated would use this service. Somebody who's not all that motivated, we'd make a referral to that service. Somebody's highly, there's different responses needed for different spaces. If the explosion phase is happening, does anybody have any suggestions? Yeah, it's pretty obvious. Emergency police, call 000, get a domestic violence order, a personal protective order, or an AVO, depending on what state you live in. But basically, the response from the emergency services, the legal restraints that they can then say to separate people to stop that immediate violence, and quite possibly emergency accommodation to keep them separated. So I've actually looked at some of the police paperwork. It's amazing what you can find on the internet. I found a document that quite clearly was labelled for internal use only from the Australian Federal Police. Their preference is to say, we would like to arrest. So their policy position is, according to this document, where possible, we will arrest somebody for assault just as we would for any other sort of assault. That way they've got a lot more control over the entire relationship and over the way things are going to go. If that's not possible, the police have the power in New South Wales, ACT, in most states, to tell the alleged, because nothing is proved at this stage, hasn't been through court, to tell the alleged perpetrator, stay still for up to 4 hours. We're staying right here with you until we can get a legal order restraining your behaviour. If you want to shoot through, we will arrest you. So they can wait for up to 4 hours, and they can actually on the spot get an interim personal protection order, domestic violence order, an interim order from the courts, not from the police, from the courts, ordering that person to behave in certain ways. And if they breach that order, then they've committed a crime immediately. Sorry, your question was, isn't it a crime anyway? Some of the things on the interim order will say not to assault the survivor, victim. Absolutely, that's a crime regardless. Quite often it will have words like not to harass or hinder, a lot more vague, a lot lower threshold. And therefore it's spelt out, it's a lot clearer. Yeah, technically they can be arrested for those regardless, but in this case it's much clearer. The document has made it very clear this is what you're not to do. And it can include things that aren't illegal, such as you need to stay at least 50 metres or 100 metres away from this person. That's not illegal the rest of the time. It can say you mustn't go to certain locations that this person frequents. So I don't want to make this too personal, but you could actually have a domestic violence order that said that the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, is not to come within 100 metres of this location here. Unless, yeah, that's right, the order would need to clarify whether they're a student, but the order could actually say just stay away from this location because this is where you come to college, therefore not going to happen. That wouldn't be illegal the rest of the time. It would be when there's an order. So the police can order the person to sit still, wait. I haven't seen the ACT version. In New South Wales, they've actually got a little printer on the dashboard that will print out the document that can be handed immediately to the alleged perpetrator. Well, I do keep saying alleged because there's a balance that they need to set here. If it needs to be proved that the assault happened, that the violence happened, then fine, we can do that. That goes through the court. Only a court can prove that. That takes time. Having an AVO against you is not proof of having committed any crime. It's proof that somebody has alleged and felt the need and convinced the court that they are in need of protection. So it's a subtle difference, but it means this is the balance that they're constantly trying to carry here, is we don't want to make it too easy for somebody to make an allegation with no evidence, and there's a major consequence for that. But at the same time, we don't want to tip the balance the other way, that they have to have so much evidence that they're not protected in the meantime. So these orders are not evidence of somebody having committed a crime or an assault or violence of any sort. They are evidence of somebody being able to convince the court that they are in need of a degree of security. Emergency accommodation is the third thing on our list here. That's a typical response. There is women's refuges set up all over for exactly this purpose. That's during the explosion phase. You can access emergency accommodation at pretty much any phase here, but our client is unlikely to be grabbing at emergency accommodation much of the other times. Now, during this phase here, this is after the violent explosion. Domestic violence order, personal protection order, still very, very likely to happen, and emergency accommodation still there. But the further over to the left they go, the less inclined people are to access those services. During this phase, it's a little bit more difficult because this is not the phase where people are likely, especially the furthest over, especially during the honeymoon phase, not so likely to be putting in a personal protective order. Then we put in what we call a safety plan. So then we talk to the client and say, would it be a good idea to put in a safety plan just in case? So talking to our client, saying this has happened in the past, you've got free will, you're able to make your own choices. Can you just clarify me, what are the odds on something like this happening again in the next 6 to 12 months? Or out of 10, what's the likelihood? People are generally fairly realistic. Again, the further to the left, the more realistic they are. Sorry, the further to the right, the more on the picture in the front of you. I've only done this a few times, but I've talked to other workers. They've said that people are generally rarely saying that it's less than 5 or 10% possibility. Use that in your discussion to say, okay, since the consequences of that 1 in 10 possibility are so severe, let's talk about a safety plan. And this is a bit of a brainstorming session, a bit of a yarn, a bit of a, okay, what is there that could make you, what is it that you wished you'd had prior to the explosion? So that could be a bit of cash set aside, it could be some emergency numbers, it could be knowing a key word with a friend, so a safety word that they know if you say a certain word during a phone call that's going to be your signal that you need some help, but you're not able to say I need some help and send the police because that would be a giveaway. Those sorts of plans. For young people, I've known them to have a backpack with some warm clothes and the old mobile phone. Lots of people have an old mobile phone out of service, it's no longer on a plan of any sort. So long as the battery is charged, you can still call an emergency number on that. So that can be an asset. If you're cleverer than I am, if you're about as clever as I am, if you did a bit of research, you'd find that a phone that is out of its plan can sometimes still be accessing Wi-Fi and therefore can still have a internet connection there that can allow you to call a friend using FaceTime or something similar. That's right. So using Messenger, using any of those sort of apps. That can be an asset to have tucked away in the bottom of a little backpack in the back shed. An escape plan, someone to go to, some key numbers, a little bit of cash, all of those sort of things as part of the safety plan. So again, emphasising, I'll trust you. You're in your honeymoon phase, you're making your own decision, but you did say there's a 1 in 10 chance and the consequences are so severe, let's put some stuff aside. One of the times the violence is most likely to happen is when the woman is pregnant or when the child is quite young. So basically when they are at their most vulnerable. That horrifies me, but people with small kids tend to have a bag already packed with nappies, bottle, a few key things like that. Having some extras stashed in there is a useful thing. Men very rarely poke around in women's hygiene products, so therefore that box can be a convenient place to have some phone numbers, a bit of cash. It's all a safety plan. So brainstorming those sort of ideas. There is some examples online. Building up the safety networks and skills. Quite often the way that this build up and standover phases work is that the person taking control is cutting off those networks. So there's some quite clever services on the website I'll get you to look at later that are around just having extra networks, extra contacts, extra people and extra skills around communication and so on. Throughout all of this, you're going to want to do just a bit of an assessment to check how safe that person is right here, right now, and how safe you are. So does the perpetrator know that you are here now? Are we in any danger? I should probably put that first. But yeah, checking that, just a little bit of a check in there that everybody is safe is a key element. This, you're not going to be able to read it all, but this is from the Domestic Violence Service here in Canberra. They've got quite a neat little safety plan that tells you, and they make a key point here, which is a person who uses violence and abuse may become more controlling, abusive and dangerous when they believe the person subjected to violence is planning to leave, because that threatens their power and control. So at that point of leaving is actually the most dangerous for the survivor. So it should be planned. And there's key questions here. They encourage you to ring their number, which I'll give you at the end of the lesson. But before you leave, think about things like, how are you going to leave? You're going to do it by foot or by car? Are you going to call a friend? Are you going to go to family, friend, hotel? What are you going to take? Pack your important documents, purchase a mobile phone and make sure it's charged and has credit, vary your route, all sorts of things like that. There's 2 pages of this. We won't look at it all now. But that's also part of the safety planning. So one of the key questions that people often ask is, why do they stay in a relationship like that? Now, we've explored some of that with the cycle. We'll explore a little further with a TED talk, but I think within the room, just about everybody could probably think of some reasons. So let's brainstorm in small groups, think of reasons spread around. If you must leave, this could be a good time to do it very subtly, but have a bit of a brainstorm. Come up with a list. If you're stuck, I'm going to put on the whiteboard a couple of key groups who are also particularly vulnerable that you might particularly add to your list. But let's think that through. I'll give you 5-10 minutes to think about it. But yeah, just form groups. That'd be great. Okay, that was a good discussion. So I don't know that I need to teach this bit because you guys have got a pretty good handle on what might be going on for people. Here's the list I prepared earlier. The loss of children. Some people may fear that they would lose their children if they left the relationship. They would feel like failures, as you mentioned. They would feel a lot of guilt and like they had somehow, there's still that carryover of the feeling of that they caused it, they're guilty. The belief that kids need to have a father. So regardless of everything else, it's just wrong that kids are raised, especially boys are raised without a strong male role model in the family. That's a belief that people have. People have had bad experiences in the past, as you mentioned. That's not really going to encourage them to try again. Protecting the children. So this is one that people didn't mention, but sometimes people will stay in a violent relationship so that the kids don't get hurt. So long as I'm here, some partners will say, so long as I'm here, the kids don't get hurt because it's all directed at me, and I'd prefer to do that than run the risk that they are going to get hurt. Lack of resources and support, so people just not knowing the sheer economics of it was one of the first things people mentioned. The abuser promised to change, as we found in the cycle we were looking at earlier, so therefore let's stay in the relationship, blah, blah, blah. Love is a key factor. Let's not write this off. People want to stay, people want to make it work. Culture, people mentioned culture, religion, community, and family history. This is not what my family does. I would be the first to leave. I'm not about to do that. My mum stayed with my dad, my grandparents. There's a bit of family history there as to this is just not what our lot do. Otherwise, you've found a great many of these just through discussion, and I appreciate those of you who took the time to share. Seriously, that's appreciated. You didn't need to do that, but I do appreciate it. A couple of key areas though, key groups that we also need to be wary of. Those who are recent immigrants have a fear of deportation. They may be further isolated. There's language barriers, there's cultural taboos, there's shame and dishonour. So let's keep in mind, and you'll see when you look at the websites, that there are some specific services for people from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds as to what some of their, some services specifically to help people in those groups because they are particularly vulnerable for these reasons. And specific cultural, I mentioned taboos, okay. People from the diverse sexualities, backgrounds, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex. There's the threat that somebody would be outed. So if you were to leave me, then I'm going to make sure your entire family knows. Yeah, there's some power and control that comes back to our original definition there. People using their power and coercion. Apparently, I haven't experienced this because I'm not in one of these relationships, but I've been told that the police at times can see that as just, you know, it's not the direct, it's not the power that we expect. They're used to man against woman. They are reportedly, I think this varies from one officer to another, but some are less active, less taking it serious when it's a woman against a man, or when it's a woman against a woman or a man against a man. It's this mutual, oh yeah, they're just catfighting. It's not the direct power rescuer relationship. There is some reluctance to bring negative attention to the community. So there's a bit of a reluctance to talk about same-sex violence because it's a community that already cops enough grief without this being discussed in public. So that can be an issue. And finally, there's no simple legal processes. It's not like you're married, then you're separated, then divorced. The legal arrangement is a bit more difficult. People who are disabled, astonishingly high statistics around the abuse rates of people who are vulnerable through their disability. So a lot of this you can probably think of, but draw your mind to this when you're working with these different communities. There's communication limitations, there's the dependence on the abuser, or the fact that they would lose their caretaker, their own self-esteem. They already see themselves as damaged. This just exacerbates that. They're not about to, they don't have the self-assurance needed to break out of a relationship on occasion. And they might just be physically incapable. They're stuck there. They've got no way out. So that's a few extra areas to think about beyond those that we brainstormed a moment ago for specific vulnerable populations. The websites I'd recommend, or that I've actually resourced much of this information from, as well as discussions with industry. 1-800-RESPECT. What I love about these people is their phone number is really easy to remember. It's 1-800-RESPECT. You don't need to have that written down. So that's a national number. It's got a great website. It's got some great info there. And it's easy to remember to get some support. The Domestic Violence Crisis Service has got a beautiful website, some really good focused information there, dpcs.org.au. And again, they've got a 24-hour crisis line. This is an ACT this is our local service. And they run a range of other services, and they're one of my major sources.